Hi Sarah, how are you?
I'm good, thanks. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you okay. You could just test your slides, make sure that everything is working.
Yeah, that'd be great. One sec, let me pull them up. It says my screen sharing is paused. Let me quick resume and see if that helps. Try it again.
Okay, great.
Looks like that seems to be working.
Yes, cool.
Okay, should I just leave it like that?
Um, you can, if that's what you would prefer. I'm waiting for Lauren and then I'll start letting the rest of the participants in.
Okay, sounds great.
There.
Hillary, can I ask you a question?
Of course.
So in the email, Lauren said that it's 30 minutes of
Yes.
me just talking, and then we'll have questions after that.
Yes.
Okay. That works for me. Is that something that we always do it that way, or do sometimes people ask clarifying questions during?
Yeah, so the general format is 30 minutes and then 30 minutes of presentation, 30 minutes of Q&A. But sometimes it does go where if the presenter is comfortable with the clarifying questions and can answer them as things go, then usually we're monitoring the chat and try to insert those in at moments that make sense.
Okay, yeah, I'm happy to have questions as we go along, but I'm
Okay.
also happy to do whatever you prefer to.
Okay, that works. I'll just let Lauren know that you're happy to take questions while it's going, and then she can like pause in certain spaces. And we can also let them know at the beginning that like they can raise hand, and we can go with that feature as well.
Okay, sounds good.
All right, great.
Hi, Sarah. Oh, you're muted.
Yep. Yeah.
Thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
We'll see, we'll give people a couple minutes to drop in.
So Lauren, I haven't let anyone in. People are in the waiting room.
Oh, okay.
So we're gonna go regular format, 30 minutes, presentation, 30 minutes, Q&A. Sarah said she's happy to take questions as the presentation is going.
Yeah,
So we
and if
can
you
do that.
yeah, and if you spill over 30 minutes, that's usually fine too. It frequently happens, especially with people interrupting you with questions.
Mhm.
And I don't know if you need to jump right after, but also it's sometimes questions sort of spill over after the
Okay.
hour. Is that okay?
Sounds good. Yeah, I kind of prepared enough slides that like if I was gonna talk for just 30 minutes, that would work. But if there's ends up being questions throughout, I'm used to that, and then we'll probably just go longer.
Okay, great. So I'm gonna let these people in and I'm gonna disable the waiting room so people can just join as it's going.
Okay, hi everyone. It seems like we are reaching a critical mass. So I'd like to thank Sarah Johnston for joining us today and presenting her paper, An Empirical Analysis of the Interconnection Queue. The current plan is that she's going to present for about 30 minutes, and then we'll take a Q&A with a discussion of, policy around the interconnection process and its implications for, the introduction of new generation into the grid. But if you have any clarifying questions, just raise your hand and I'll try to keep an eye on that and interrupt. So yeah, thank you so much for coming, Sarah, and I'll let you take it away.
Okay, sounds great. Thanks a lot for having me. This is joint work. So I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Agricultural and Applied Economics at UW-Madison. And this is joint work with Yifei Liu, who's a PhD student at UW-Madison, and Chenyu Yang, who's near you guys at the University of Maryland in the economics department. So electricity production accounts for over 25% of global carbon emissions, as well as US carbon dioxide emissions. And so if you look at many countries' climate policies, they often center around decarbonizing electricity production, while simultaneously electrifying other sectors like transportation and heating. Meeting these goals will require large investment in wind and solar powered electricity generation. Currently, if you want to build one of these generators, you have to go through a process known as the interconnection queue. Right, so the way it works in the US is that if you want to build a new wind or solar generator, you have to go through this interconnection process before you begin operation. You join a waitlist known as the interconnection queue. And then you wait to have studies done to identify whether, if you build a new generator in this location, is it going to overload the grid? And if so, what new equipment is necessary to resolve this overload? So you might think, here there's an overload, and if you want to connect in this location, you're going to have to rebuild a transmission line, and it's going to cost $5 million. The way the system works in the US is that connecting generators must pay for the necessary grid upgrades. And so after you have the final study done, you get your final interconnection cost estimate, and you can pay the interconnection cost and connect to the grid. Historically, the way this has worked is it's been largely first come, first serve. So the priority for getting the studies that you're waiting for is based on the date that you enter the queue. This interconnection process can be both slow and costly. System researchers at Berkeley Labs collected nationwide data on this process, and they found that it takes about 3.5 years on average from when a generator enters the queue to when it begins operation, at least in the last decade in the US. The costs of interconnecting can also be quite high. And it's not uncommon to see costs that are comparable to these costs of building the project. This is seen as especially problematic for renewable energy generators, which are more location constrained. So about 85% of renewable energy generators, and here I'm going to use renewable energy to refer to wind and solar generators, that enter the queues never begin operation. This compares to 68% for fossil fuel generators. So lots and lots of generators that are in these queues never get completed. Many are dropping out, but renewable generators drop out at a higher rate. And a recent survey of about 40 solar developers found that interconnection was the single largest barrier they listed to solar development, ahead of permitting difficulties, supply chain issues, and local opposition. So there's this widespread perception that the system as we currently have it is not working. And so both FERC, the regulator, and these individual grid operators are in the process of making reforms. So FERC recently issued Order 2023 that outlines guidelines for reforming this interconnection system. So in this paper, we're going to ask, what are the effects of alternative interconnection policies on investment in electricity generation capacity? So we're going to look at historically how the process has worked. We're going to digitize a bunch of new data on that process. And we're going to find that the necessary studies are often delayed. And there's also this congestion externality. So when more generators are waiting for studies, the rate at which these studies are delivered slows down. We'll also find that interconnection costs are variable, but they can be very high. They're difficult to predict, and they cause generators to drop out of these queues. We're then going to develop a dynamic model that builds on these facts and use it to simulate counterfactual policies. We're going to find some of these policies lead to significant increases in renewable generation capacity. And then we're going to show that these increases would result in large climate benefits from avoided carbon emissions. I'm not going to talk too much about the related literature. I wanted to highlight a couple of papers. So one is this Rand et al. Study from 2023. These researchers at Berkeley Labs have also digitized a lot of new data on interconnection queues that we think is very complementary to the analysis that we're doing. So we're going to do a very detailed analysis of one of the regional grid operators, but they have looked at interconnection costs and delays nationwide. And so our findings often are very similar to what they're finding as well, using different data. There's also some recent papers in the economics literature studying the benefits of large-scale investment in electricity transmission for investment in renewable energy. For example, this Gonzalez, Ito, and Regant paper looks at this building this new infrastructure in Chile and finds that there's lots of entry by renewables in response to this investment in electricity transmission. We're estimating the dynamic model of investment, and so that's going to be related to several other papers that do that. And then we're studying a queue, and we're going to draw on insights from this literature on market design, on how we should estimate models, these empirical models, of queuing, and also think about kind of what is the optimal design. So I'm going to give some background both on our setting and just how the interconnection process works, and then I'll jump into this descriptive statistics using this data. So we're going to focus on PJM, this big grid operator in the Mid-Atlantic. It's the largest of the regional grid operators. It serves about 65 million people. All these regions have slightly different interconnection processes, but in many ways, this is similar to the other regional grid operators. And the queue during the time period we study, so the years we're going to study are generators that entered from 2008 through 2020. This queue is dominated by solar, wind, and natural gas generators. When we think about the participants in this process, first is the grid operator PJM, which is going to manage the process and its rules. It's also going to plan larger scale transmission investment through this transmission planning process. Then there's the developers that are going to plan and build the generators. Interconnection is happening early in the project development, so before construction. And so you can think about this interconnection process going on before they actually make a decision to construct the generator. And each developer's market share is going to be quite small. And so it's the case that there's many, many developers in the queue while we're looking at it. Then there's transmission owners. These are regulated utilities that are conducting the engineering studies. They don't actually own the upgrades that the connecting generators pay for, and so they're not benefiting from them. We're going to think about them as not exercising market power and just saying, here's what the study says, and here's what the cost of that is. Right. Generators can enter the queue twice a year. Those that enter at the same time are going to form a cohort, and priority for getting these interconnection studies is going to be by cohort. To enter the queue, you have to demonstrate site control, which means you have to show you have enough land secured to build the proposed generator. So you could own the land, you could lease the land, or you could have an exclusive option to lease the land. Once you've entered the queue, there's up to 3 engineering studies are done sequentially. For the purposes of today, you can just think about them as needing 3 studies. Each study is going to provide an estimate of the interconnection cost, and later studies are more detailed and thorough and provide better estimates. So you can think about these generators waiting in the queue and updating their expectations about what the final interconnection cost will be as they receive these studies. Generators pay a small fee for each study, and they can leave the queue at any time. Right, so historically, it's been very inexpensive to enter the queue in PJM and to stay in the queue. So the fees for these studies are quite low. And they're 90% refundable, less any costs that have already been incurred. Okay. PJM, like other grid operators, has seen a large increase in requests. And so this graph is plotting for each year the number of new entries into the PJM queue. You can see starting in around 2015, we see this dramatic increase in the number of generators entering the queue each year. And we see this in all the other grid operators as well. PJM, I think maybe even a little more so because there's been a lot of solar in PJM, and these solar generators tend to be quite small. And so for the same increase in capacity, we're going to have a lot more interconnection requests. We're going to collect data from PDFs of these studies. So when PJM does these studies, then you can see the interconnection costs and some other information in the study. The formulates, especially for earlier years, are pretty irregular. So we hand collect this data. We collected data for all requests from generators that entered the queue from 2008 through 2020. It's about 4,000 requests, and it corresponds to about 7,000 studies. We're going to collect the interconnection costs. Today, I'm going to combine the direct connection costs and the network upgrade. So everything I show you will just show one cost that basically sums these two up. What tests were performed and the issue dates of these studies. And then for all requests from 1997 through 2022, we observe the queue date, the in-service and withdrawal dates, as well as the location, the generator type, and size. So we can use this historic data to construct the size of the queue at any time in our sample. All right, so now I'm going to show some descriptive statistics from these data on both the times, so how long the wait is for these studies, as well as the costs, these interconnection costs. And I can pause here if anyone has any questions before I get into that. Okay, sounds good. Okay, so the necessary studies, the timeline, there's an official timeline for PJM for how long these studies are supposed to take. The first study is called a feasibility study. It's rather cursory, and it is officially supposed to be returned within 3 months. And the data we see on average between when generators enter the queue and when they receive it is 4 months, sorry, on the median. So that tends to be quite quick. It's not super informative because generators allocation to any shared network upgrade costs is not given in that study. The second study is called the impact study. Officially, should take about 4 months. The median we see in the data is about 7 months, and the 90th percentile is 30 months. Right? So sometimes the study can be quite delayed. And then the third and final study is the facility study. Officially, it's supposed to take about 6 months. It's the most in-depth study. The median we see in the data is 16 months, and the 90th percentile is 35 months. Right. One thing to note about these are weights till the final version of the study. And so one reason that they can sometimes take so much longer than the official timeline is that the generator will get back a study and then it'll need to be revised. And so revisions are one thing that slows things down. This is not from the data, but just one thing about these delays is we've heard that they can be costly. So you can think about developers have options to lease the land. These options can expire, and so they would have to go back and renegotiate with landowners. And also, particularly for renewable generators, they're often trying to sign a long-term contract called a PPA. And having these long and uncertain waits can make it difficult to get these power purchase agreements signed. Great. We also want to look at, well, are these delays longer when there's more generators ahead in the queue? So we're going to estimate a flexible probit model of steady delivery, controlling for your fixed effects. So the variation we're going to be using is comparing generators that are farther up in the queue to those that are farther back, and see how that affects the probability they're going to get their study in each given quarter. We find that there's these congestion effects, particularly for the third and final study. Somewhat surprisingly, we don't find them for the second study. But if you take the marginal effects from this probit model, they imply that a 10% increase in the number of higher queue generators, so the number of generators ahead in the queue, reduces the third study arrival probability in a given quarter by about 5%. Right. You could also think that maybe it's not the number of generators ahead of you in the queue, but how big they are. So like, what's the total capacity ahead of you in the queue? We find that the number of higher priority generators matters a lot more than the size of the higher priority generators. Right, moving on to the cost data. So we find that these costs are quite variable. So most generators have low interconnection costs estimates. These are the interconnection cost estimates for the second study plotted here in the histogram. And they're plotted in cost estimates in dollars per kilowatt of capacity. So we're going to normalize everything by capacity. We don't find huge economies of scale in these interconnection costs, though we find that very small generators tend to have higher costs per unit of capacity, and very large, like over 500 megawatt generators, tend to have slower ones. But in general, things scale pretty linearly in size. So we're going to divide everything by the capacity. Right, so these are from the second study, these estimates. The median cost estimate is about $50 per kilowatt. But then there's this long right tail, so the 90th percentile is about $400 per kilowatt. So about 10% of generators, they get to the second study and get a very high interconnection cost estimate. For perspective, wind and solar during this period, like ballpark for installation costs is about $1,500 per kilowatt. And so about 10% of generators are getting interconnection cost estimates that are pretty sizable share of the total construction cost. Another way to think about these. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I mean, it looks like the renewable interconnection costs are, on average a bit higher than the non-renewable. Is there do you guys have an explanation for that?
Yeah, so we think that most of the reason is that they're more location constrained. So this is the raw data, but this renewables having higher costs holds up if you condition on their size, flexibility on their size. So it's not just that they're smaller on average, and also on the time period. So interconnection costs have been increasing. We see this all over the US, but also in the PJM data over time. But even conditional on year fixed effects, we see that renewables have higher costs. We think some of it's explained by distance to the transmission grid and also the voltage of the lines that they're connecting to. So renewables tend to be connecting in lower voltage, less built up parts of the transmission grid as well.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Yeah, so that's another thing that comes out of this is that renewables on average have higher interconnection costs. And then another way to think about this, about 10% have interconnection cost estimates of $400 per kilowatt. The median generator size in our sample is 20 megawatts. And that would translate into about $8 million, right, for the interconnection costs. So these costs can be quite sizable. But again, it's not that all of these requests are getting really high cost estimates. The median request has a quite low cost estimate in our data. We have some work in the paper looking at, how easy is it to predict these costs based on observable characteristics. We find that observable characteristics certainly explain some of these cost differences, including geography, but certainly not all of it. When we talk to participants, they say that one reason that these are hard to predict is that they often depend on other generators. And so PJM has this extensive cost share over the period we study, extensive cost sharing of network upgrades. And so if a few generators in a location contribute to the same overload, and say there's some mitigation measure, like upgrading a line, that needs to be taken to address that, then they will share the cost of it. But then as one of the generators drops out, then they'll have to restudy to see if they still need to upgrade that line. And if so, then the remaining generators will have their costs go up. If not, then their costs would go down. And so this can lead to cost changes across the studies. If we look at, in the data for the same generator, how do costs change across the studies? We see that on average, the cost difference is about 0. And many of them don't have big cost changes across the different studies, but it's not uncommon to have pretty large swings. So this histogram is plotting the difference between the third study cost estimate and the second study cost estimate. So this is within generator differences. And of course, it's conditional on reaching the third study. We can see that on average, it's about 0. The mean change is $7 per kilowatt. About 13% have changes above $100 per kilowatt in absolute value, right? So the tails of this are very large swings in the estimated interconnection costs. Another thing to note is on average, the difference is 0. We think this is interesting because it's also evidence that these generators are not selecting on these changes. So if generators were able to predict that their costs were going to go down, then in the sample of generators that make it to study 3, we'd expect to see that the study 3 cost was lower than the study 2 cost. But we're not seeing that in the data. Right. If we look at the relationship between interconnection costs and the probability generators drop out of the queue, we see that costs are very predictive of withdrawal. That's not to say they predict most withdrawals. So generators are dropping out for many other reasons, and we see lots of generators with low costs, interconnection costs dropping out of the queue. But we do see that generators with these high interconnection costs, so the threshold we're using here is above $100 per kilowatt. About a third of generators have high interconnection costs, according to this categorization. Those with a high cost in the second study are 22 percentage points more likely to drop out before reaching the third study. At the mean, this translates into about a 49% increase in the probability of withdrawing between the second and the third study. You could think that one reason this is maybe capturing other things. The thing we think that is maybe the most likely would be permitting issues. So you might have a high interconnection cost because you have to build new infrastructure. But maybe the reason that you're dropping out is not because it's going to be costly to build that infrastructure, but also because you can't get a permit to build that infrastructure. So we try including permitting controls, and the two that we could think of are distance to the grid. So you might think that permitting issues are a bigger concern when you're farther away from the grid or farther away to the substation that you're connecting at. And whether the county the project is located in has an ordinance restricting renewable energy development. When we do that, we get almost the same estimate. So we get, again, an effect of 22 percentage points more likely to withdraw. You have a high cost. And then this sample that we're using is generators that made it to the second study. And so you could think that selection is also a concern. So these generators know something about what their costs would be, and they still continued and made it to the second study. So to address this, we think, well, maybe we know something about costs. Generators know something about costs, but they are less able to predict the difference in costs between these studies. And so the third column, we're saying, all right, compare two generators, one with the same cost, but one had it go up from the previous study. We find very similar effects as well. I believe there's a question.
We have a question.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, it seems like if I were a project developer, there might be kind of a threshold effect where I'm going to be paying $1,000 a kilowatt to install in the first place. And so above $100 or $150 or $200 a kilowatt, there's some point where I say, yeah, it's not going to pencil out. So I was wondering, did you try different thresholds than $100 to see if like 150 or 200, you start to see sort of near universal withdrawal?
That's a
or
great
higher
question.
withdrawal rates?
Yeah, I think we did try different thresholds, and they varied in the way we expected. But we didn't do like a systematic, 100, 150, 200 and see how things change then. We certainly could. And it'd be interesting to see if there was like a certain threshold where we really see much higher rates of withdrawal. Yeah, thanks for the suggestion.
Sure, thanks.
I know it's not the variable of interest, but I'm curious, like, what sort of coefficients you were getting on the permitting controls you were throwing in. Like, were you finding a big effect of like distance to the grid?
We found the sign was in the expected direction, but my memory is that we weren't finding big effects. You could think that's something that's known, so they're selecting on it as well. So the ones that have a very long distance to the grid are good in other ways, or else they wouldn't have entered the queue. But yeah, off the top of my head, I don't know. I do think we report the coefficient in the paper. But.
Gotcha, that makes sense.
Yeah, thanks for the questions. Great, so next I'm gonna talk about, we estimate this model of the generator's decision to wait in the queue. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about the model today, though I'm happy to answer questions about it in more detail. But essentially, we're going to take the observed pattern of generators entering the queue as given. One rationale for this is that we're looking at a period where the entry costs are very low. And so we see lots and lots of entry. And so we're thinking about it as observing kind of the universe of potential entry. And then when we do policy reforms, we're going to see how they affect the generators that complete the queue as opposed to seeing how they affect entry. We will, when we do things like add an entry fee, we will say, well, some generators choose not to enter, and we'll account for that. So in the queue, each quarter, all the generators in the queue will decide whether to stay in the queue or withdraw. And when doing that, they're going to trade off the expected present value of profits from staying versus the expected present value of profits from leaving. Okay. And we're going to be pretty detailed in our model of the present value of profits from staying, not so much in the present value of profits from leaving. We just think, you leave the queue and you don't have to, you get your deposit back, you no longer have to maintain site control or do things like try and make sure that everyone in the community is on board with you building your project in that location. Right, the expected present value of profits from staying in the queue is going to depend on what your interconnection cost estimate is, because that's going to be informative about what the final cost to interconnect is going to be. How likely it is that the next study arrives soon, because waiting is going to be costly. And then other factors affecting the return to building a generator, which we're going to try and include in the model in terms of observable characteristics. Once you get the final interconnection study, the developers are going to decide whether to build the generator and begin operation or not build the generator and leave the queue. Okay. One thing about this model is that it's going to be careful about these equilibrium effects. And to give you an example, suppose the rate at which PJM is returning these necessary studies increases by a certain amount. The direct effect is going to be that wait times fall. So PJM is just processing these studies faster, and generators will not have to wait as long for them. But there's also going to be this countervailing indirect effect from these faster studies. So we talked about how waiting is costly. So if you think you're going to not have to wait as long, the present value of staying in the queue will increase, which causes more generators to stay. But as I talked about before, we find these congestion effects. So if there's more generators in the queue, it slows down study delivery. So more generators in the queue is going to increase waiting times. And so wait times are going to fall by less than we would predict if we don't account for the second effect, where more generators end up staying in the queue now that things are working better and studies are returned more quickly. And so one key feature about this model is it's going to account for these equilibrium effects. Okay, so we're going to use this model to do counterfactual simulations. I'm not going to talk about all the simulations in the paper. We have some thinking about subsidies for interconnection costs or potentially cost allocation. Today, I'm going to focus on 3 simulations. One is just decreasing wait times. So what are the returns in terms of increasing capacity if we process these interconnection studies faster? Another is more of a thought experiment, thinking about an alternative priority system where we exclude some generators from the queue. And then finally, we'll talk about adding fees. And so you could think about, we said congestion is important here. So we think there's this congestion externality. If I'm in the queue, it's going to slow down the studies for other generators in the queue. So economists would say we should have a tax for that. And so we're going to think about adding fees, both to enter the queue, and we'll also do simulations where we add fees for requesting these later studies. And we're going to do simulations where we have this fee be per generator. So each generator pays the same fee regardless of size and per megawatt. And so the fee scales linearly with capacity. Throughout, the key outcome of interest is going to be the total new capacity and the new renewable capacity in service relative to the status quo for all the generators that entered the queue from 2011 through 2020. Okay, so when we say that this worked better, the key metric we're looking at is total capacity in service. Okay, the first, we want to think about what are the effects of returning these studies faster, which would reduce wait times. So we're going to simulate increasing the arrival probability. So these generators are waiting in the queue, and there's some probability that these studies are returned that they're waiting for. Where you simulate increasing the arrival probability of the second and third studies. As I showed you, those are the 2 studies that are most likely to be delayed. The first study tends to arrive pretty reliably quickly. Okay. And you can think about this as, say PJM was able to, or these transmission owners who are doing these studies were able to hire more electrical engineers, use better software. They're just able to process these studies more quickly. The graph's going to show the additional renewable capacity added relative to the status quo. And the x-axis is showing how the wait time between when generators enter the queue and the final study falls. So you can see as you increase this rate at which PJM is returning these studies, we see decreases in average wait times and increases in capacity relative to the status quo. If we focus on the second dot from the left, that 10% dot, we see a 10% speed up is going to increase renewable capacity by about 5%. Okay. For our sample, it's going to lead to an increase of 1.6 gigawatts relative to the status quo. So a fairly large increase. And then for total generation capacity, the increase is 4 gigawatts. Yeah, I think there's a question.
Yeah, it's me again. Sorry to bug you. Is this effect of like how many more make it through, is it based just on that sort of PV of waiting versus PV of leaving calculation? Or I think you mentioned that like power purchase agreement negotiations might break down, or as things go longer, the project falls apart. Is there sort of like a endogenous decay of the projects, and like does that factor into this as well?
Yeah, so thinking about it in the model, there's two things that capture what we think is really going on, which is partly this things like power purchase agreements breaking down. One is that they're waiting is costly because we discount the future. And so we have kind of this waiting cost that's fairly flexible that captures that. And just the longer you wait, the more likely things are going to break down. We also have this unobservable shocks to the payoff from leaving the queue. And the way it works in practice is that the longer you're around, the more likely you are to get like stuck waiting in the queue, one of these shocks that kills the project, which in our case, like exits the queue. So you could think that, which I think is consistent with reality, you can think about as these generators are waiting out there longer, it's more likely something is going to go wrong before they begin operation. And at that point, it's unlikely the project would be blocked. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. Thanks.
Thank you. So we find fairly large increases in completed capacity. So when you talk to these regional grid operators, they say that there's a serious constraint in terms of being able to hire the electrical engineers needed for these studies. So we think if we could relax that constraint, that would be great. But our next counterfactual is thinking about, well, fixing this processing capacity, what could be gained by changing the prioritization, right? And so you could think about sometimes the generator that's far back in the line would be likely to complete if they were given a study more quickly. And so you could deprioritize generators that are ahead of it in line to fast track it. It's not obvious this would increase the completed capacity because, of course, the higher queue generators are going to not be less likely to complete. And so we're going to basically estimate this model where we change the input to the study process to effectively get a smaller queue. Right, so we're going to exclude some generators from being studied in each period. And they're not going to progress in the queue, but other generators are going to progress more quickly because it's essentially as if PJM is dealing with a smaller queue. We're going to choose this probability to maximize total in-service capacity and based on a pretty coarse set of observable characteristics. And so we're not going to think, this is more of a thought experiment to think about, well, if we excluded some generators, would we get increases in capacity? Which you think maybe it could happen given we have these large congestion effects. Okay. So if we have an objective to maximize total capacity that values renewable and non-renewable capacity equally, we find that we can choose these weights such that total capacity increases by about 8 gigawatts and renewable capacity by 1.5 gigawatts. If we look at what generators this mechanism removes, it's going to remove disproportionately smaller generators. Right? So if we look at the percentage by categories, this table plots for renewable and not based on size, what percentage generators are removed from the queue. We can see it's relatively more renewable generators and smaller generators. If we were to change the weights so that we value renewable capacity 3 times as much as non-renewable capacity, we'd get an increase of capacity by about 4.1 gigawatts, of which 2.7 gigawatts is renewable. Okay. So given this, we want to think about, well, another way to cause generators to select out of the queue is to have entry fees, or you could have fees for later studies. So we're going to simulate the effects of increased fees. This graph plots the effect of the entry fee, right? And so on the x-axis is what the fee is. This is a per generator fee plotted in the graph. And the green line plots the added renewable capacity relative to the status quo. The purple line plots all capacity added relative to the status quo and how that changes with the fee. And so initially we see an increase in total capacity added. And then as we get to higher levels of fee, eventually we get a lowest fee. We find that if your goal is just to maximize total capacity, a $900,000 fee per generator adds about 7 gigawatts of capacity, but this is disproportionately non-renewable capacity. So only 0.8 gigawatts of this is renewable capacity. We find a per megawatt entry fee is less effective at increasing capacity, but it can increase capacity slightly, but none of the increase comes from renewables. And then we find relative to entry fees, increasing fees for later studies are less effective if your goal is just to increase capacity. Finally, to get a sense of the climate benefits, so a lot of the counterfactuals you look at result in increases in renewable energy capacity from about 0.5 to 2 gigawatts. For increases in this range, we use the AVERT climate tool from the EPA to think about, well, if we had that much more wind and solar generation capacity in the mid-Atlantic, what would be the effects in terms of climate emissions, of reductions in CO2 emissions? We find at this new social cost of carbon of $185 per ton, each gigawatt of renewable capacity in PJM confers about 250 million per year in benefits in terms of avoided carbon dioxide emissions. So just to conclude, we find interconnection costs are variable, but they can be very high, and they're a key factor in withdrawal decisions. We find that as there's more higher queue generators, so there's more generators ahead of a generator in the queue, it's less likely to receive its final study in each period. An alternative queuing mechanism can increase capacity, though it mostly does so by removing small generators. A flat fee also increases completed capacity, but most of the increase, even more so than this alternative queuing mechanism, is coming from non-renewable generators. And then finally, these policy simulations all take transmission planning by the grid operators given, but you could think that more large-scale transmission investment could also alleviate congestion and have important effects on the queue. Great, thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Sarah. So does anyone have any opening questions? I guess Michael.
Thanks, Lauren, and thanks, Sarah. It was really, really interesting. I'm curious, and I'm not a data person. I apologize if this is a naive question or one that you've already answered and I missed it. But does your analysis assume? I know you sort of looked at factors that make generators more likely to drop out of the queue. Did you account for or control in any way for something we've heard anecdotally, which is that a lot of generators in the queue don't actually have intent to build, right? It might be one developer with funding to build one facility, but they submit three different queue applications at different locations, fishing for whichever one has the lowest interconnection costs. So at least 2 out of those 3 interconnection requests were always going to drop out of the queue. Is that sort of accounted for in your work?
Yeah, so we don't account for that directly. We try and look for it. I think depending on, it does affect a little bit the interpretation. We try and be a little careful that our results aren't sensitive to if generators put a location, developers put multiple requests in the same location. There's just not that much of that. And then we collect data on who owns the projects. But of course, that's a little bit tricky to do for projects that aren't built. So we see the developer name, or we see the person putting in the request name starting in the second interconnection study. With the second study is basically once the network upgrade costs get allocated. So that's when there's actually decent information about it. But the problem is it's typically a project-specific LLC. So it's not the actual developer. And so we attempted to match those, and we match about half of them. So about half of the requests in the queue, we can match to the developer. And then we look within a developer, within a cohort, like, so say, End Energy has 6 requests in a particular cohort. How often do we see them just building one? Often we see they'll build all of them or none of them. And so we don't think that that is super common, but again, it's not something that we can look at directly, especially for the earliest requests. So the feasibility study requests, we don't know who they correspond to. So I'd love to hear more about that and how you think maybe it would show up in the data so that we could look for it. But it's not something that we can separate out beyond that.
Got it. Thank you.
Hi, Sarah. Thanks for the presentation. I have a question for you. I was intrigued by the finding around fees. And I thought to myself, what about an attribute-based fee? Like a fee for, I don't know, how about carbon? And then I thought, well, don't we have a natural experiment in the US where we have a couple of jurisdictions, say the RGGI jurisdiction and the California cap and trade program jurisdictions, where there is essentially a price on emissions, not for interconnecting, but just to, exist. And so I'm wondering if there's a natural experiment there where you might be able to compare those regions with regions that don't have comparable fees.
I see.
So it's just a thought. I don't know if you have a reaction now. I just wanted to throw that out there. I wondered.
Thanks. Yeah, we'll have to think about it more. I think that is typically coming in the returns to building a generator, which in theory we could be very flexible. So we're trying to use a bunch of observable characteristics. We could probably do a better job. Like we have some state fixed effects in year, but trying to look at, say, RGGI and putting in the right interactions to kind of account for that. But we'll have to think more about that. And also just this interesting of attribute based.
Yeah.
I mean, the thing about this flat fee is like you're kind of letting generators screen themselves. But we haven't done as much of comparing like why it gives a different thing to this alternative queuing mechanism, which we find is better at keeping in these renewable generators that actually, have a decent probability of completion.
And then I'll throw out one other thought while I'm on it. I thought that's been in my mind for quite some time is the notion of auctioning the opportunity to interconnect to the grid.
Mhm.
The idea that these grids in our distribution systems have certain hosting capacity, and maybe we should compete for the opportunity to connect to them. Again, attribute-based competition potentially, but I wonder if you've ever thought about that. And I guess that's just a way of allowing, interconnection interests to compete to set the fee rather than just a set fee. I think that's what auctioning might operationally look like. But I just want to throw that out there. Thanks for your presentation.
Thanks. Yeah, I think the auction idea is quite interesting as well. I think one thing that you need to figure out is what places are good. I don't think is obvious, except for in some cases it is, right? Like if you have a coal plant retiring, that seems like a wonderful place, and that is quite valuable, that interconnection.
Yeah.
But it's certainly something that it comes up. People think that would be really interesting, and so we should think more about how you could operationalize that. Another thing that sometimes people talk about is just paying to prioritize yourself higher. So generation is maybe like, otherwise it seems like things are going to be set. And so just pay to jump up ahead in the queue. You can think of fees are along this line, but it's relatively coarse compared to something like an auction or paying for priority.
In San Francisco, if you want a permit for your house project, you have to pay a private person to be your expediter at the planning department to sit there and just try to get your permit expedited.
Oh my goodness. It seems very un-San Franciscan to allow you to do that.
That's a job I would not want. Again, thanks for your presentation. Terrific stuff.
And thanks for the thought-provoking comments.
We have a question from Ted now.
Thanks. Hi, thanks so much for the presentation. One thing I was thinking about, I've looked at the Berkeley data you've talked about the Lawrence Berkeley Lab, about sort of the changing timelines and also what's in interconnection queues over time. And I wonder, it seems like from what I've seen that the percentage of renewable versus other generators in the most recent years it's even much higher renewable than even back in 2010 or 2012. And I wonder if if you have any sense, if you did any sensitivities or just have any sense from what you've looked at, if you kind of took some of the proposed mechanisms like the fee and applied them to a queue that was only renewable or vast majority renewable, is it possible you'd see a different result and actually see the renewable increase, or would you kind of just see a result where there's really no particular increase in capacity if you constrain or remove the other?
Thanks. Yeah, that's a great question. I guess two thoughts. One our queue is that the data that we have, even though we go back farther in time, it's over 70% renewable generators. I think it's over half of the requested capacity is renewable. But I agree that that is, I don't know, the later years are even more so than that. And I think that that's a good point. I think that it would be more, we're also seeing larger renewables in more recent years. And so I think that renewables for that composition would do, the increase would be more on the renewable side. I mean, I think we would see an increase in the renewable side as opposed to no increase at all if the queue is all renewable, given these policies. I think that also, though, there is quite a concern about reliability, especially in PJM, given, and it's hard to predict load growth, but I think there's some expectation of load growth from data centers as well as electric vehicles. And so I think there is natural gas that people see as important to, and batteries that people see as important to get through the queues as well.
Oh, so I wasn't thinking about that. So batteries are also in the other category?
Yeah, they are in the other category. We don't see a ton in our sample. They're coming in a lot right at the end.
Got
Yeah.
it. Thanks, that's
It's
helpful.
kind of strange that batteries would even have to be in the queue because you would think they would be like perfectly curtailable so that they would never overload the system if they were just told not to. Is that crazy?
No, I think, I'm not an expert on this, but yeah, my understanding is there's an argument that batteries shouldn't have to go through this process. But
Matthias?
Yeah, I think, well, Lauren, you got at one of the challenges of this, which is that I think that in most jurisdictions, they model the new generator as if it is going to run 100% output at the most difficult time. And then the grid has to be ready to handle that, which might not be the right standard, but that would hit batteries as much as the renewables, I think. I wanted to ask about you talked some about the benefit of speeding up the queue. And I wondered if you have any idea of how that compares to the cost of doing the studies themselves. Like you mentioned that there's a limit on the number of electrical engineers they can get in to do the studies, but it seems like if they were willing to pay them more, they might be able to increase the number of people doing it. And that might be very small compared to, the cost of doing the studies themselves might be very small, or even if you doubled it, might be very small compared to the benefits of getting more renewables through.
yeah, no, that's a great suggestion. We haven't done, given our model, we should be able to kind of compare the benefit to these generators that are completed or the external benefits in terms of carbon emissions reductions to what the cost would be of the speed up, I believe. I guess we don't have a good model about how like PJM spending money translates into speed up. But you could think about kind of a back of the envelope. My sense is that these benefits outweigh what would be reasonable costs of, big increases in salaries for these electrical engineers. But we haven't done that back of the envelope, and I think it'd be really interesting to do.
Thanks.
Question from Alice.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for the presentation. I am interested in any evidence that you saw, and this might have been kind of anecdotal, for opposition to these interconnection like to the whatever potential increase in transmission would be required for the project as opposed to, sorry. I'm really sorry. I'm having trouble. Okay. Yeah, as opposed to the like site of the generation itself, the project.
So you're talking about having a hard time building the necessary network upgrades?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, I think this is certainly, like, we haven't heard a particular story, but part of the reason we were trying to control for some of these permitting difficulties is because it seems like a very reasonable problem to run into, and it must be happening because some of the recent reforms address site control, not just for the project itself, but also for this right of way between the project and the grid, where project and the connection point. And so I think this certainly happens. I don't know how common it is. Feel free to follow up if that didn't answer your question too. Thanks. It's important to think about.
Let's go with Blake and then Jamie.
Thank you for the excellent talk.
I think we're having a hard time hearing you, Blake.
I think Blake is waiting to interconnect.
Yeah, maybe you go, Jamie.
Sure. Sorry, Blake. Yeah, we couldn't really hear you. Yeah, the issue of the batteries came up, and it's just kind of worth asking and looking back at these studies, right? I think, these studies were, I'm not super familiar with them, but these interconnection studies, the rules were designed back in the day of a dumb grid, a two-way grid, without smart technologies. And so, the question of the battery and the observation that, do you really have to treat this like pure generation? The question applies to all generation at this point. Can it be paired with smart strategies or technologies? And so is there something particularly troublesome about the studies themselves that either is filtering out the bad projects or making it hard for the good ones to compete, and they kind of see the writing on the wall? And then this observation, I think it was Michael or maybe Ted who observed that, 2/3 of the interconnection requests we know are ultimately going to be real anyway. So what's going on there? And is there a solution there that just makes the process more efficient? So sorry, those are kind of layered questions, but yeah, it's been a bit of a bee in my bonnet about these studies and the kind of archaic assumptions made by how smart the generation can be, right? And it hurts resources like batteries.
Yeah, I guess to the first question, I'm not sure how difficult it is to incorporate it. I think there's a big, I think there's a sense that this process needs to be reformed. And PJM is making fairly large changes to its interconnection process, as are a lot of these grid operators. So I think there is a will to do these reforms. But at the same time, I think these institutions change pretty slowly in general. And we're going through a transition that's just been quite difficult on the system, but I think that most of the reforms are kind of slowly moving in these directions. So I'm not sure about how difficult it is, but I think we are moving that direction, but probably not as fast as people would like to see. In terms of, and I think PJM is also difficult with its capacity market and trying to figure out, there's an interaction between those two, because they need to know deliverability for the capacity market. In terms of 2/3 aren't going to be real, certainly if you increase the fees to enter the queue, if we think that these are just really low value requests that are put in because it's cheap to enter, as we increase fees, we see fewer generators entering. In practice, some of the grid operators that did increase these fees, I think, were a little disappointed at how many entries they still got to the queue. And I think part of that is because the wait times are so long that there's a lot of true uncertainty. Like, you don't know where the demand is going to be good. In terms of 3 to build 1, I guess one potential pushback against that is I think that if you could get PPAs for all 3 of these, some developers are potentially that capacity constrained, but I think if you had a long-term contract for all 3 projects, certainly as the bigger developers, I would think would want to build all 3 of those projects. And so in that case, it's a little bit less of we put in 3 to build 1 as opposed to we put in these requests. They have fairly low probabilities because there's a lot of uncertainty between now and 5 years from now when I'm going to actually build this project.
Thank you. Laura, I don't know if you saw Blake's question came in via chat.
Yeah, Blake's question is there data where generators are lumped together either independently or by the ISO/RTO process? This is working off the finding that larger capacity generators finish faster.
So I know for PJM, these generators are not, for them, there's a few like specific examples where there's multiple requests together, but not in general for the period that we're studying in PJM. We don't, just to be clear, we don't find that larger generators finish faster. We actually find that the waits are longer for these larger generators. And there's some evidence, we're not experts, but the studies are more complex for the larger generators. If you just look at the number of pages for the studies, they are larger for the larger generators. That said, if your goal is to maximize capacity, we find that, even if it takes a little bit longer and the probability of completion for a request is a bit smaller for a larger generator, we find that, of course, the expected increase in capacity from them is larger.
I have a question. I was trying to think through like just this difference between developers that are regulated utilities versus independent producers. Like, do you see any evidence in your data that like these two different types of developers interact with the queue any differently? Because I guess what I just imagine is that regulated utilities would just pass on any interconnection costs to consumers. So maybe that they would be a little bit like less sensitive to big interconnection fees.
We haven't looked at that. I guess one thing that this often is broken down pretty much by generation, in the sense that renewables are almost exclusively these independent power producers when we're matching them to developers, whereas the regulated utilities are more likely for these natural gas plants and natural gas operates. That'd be an interesting thing to look at, because once we have the developer, it's not that hard to match to regulated versus not, and we could see whether they're less sensitive in terms of withdrawing to these interconnection costs.
But then I guess it becomes impossible to identify, right? Because it's so correlated with like the generation type and the size of the generator.
Yeah, I think at least within natural gas, there's probably some variation. So we could see within there's natural gas. But yeah, I guess you're right that it'd probably be correlated with location and some other things as well. But yeah, it's an interesting thing that we have not thought about that.
So Sarah said that she would be happy to stay on a bit after if anyone has any questions. But thanks everyone for joining. Does anyone else have any other questions?
Thanks a lot for having me and for the excellent questions.
Terrific stuff. Thank you, Sarah. I have to jump.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Got to run to, unfortunately.
Okay. It seems like people are jumping, but yeah, thank you so much for coming. It's really interesting stuff. We have a bunch of projects at EDF that are mostly using like engineering models of capacity, like mostly like using engineering models, like least cost planning models, to try and think about yeah, how the energy transition would happen. And I've sort of been pulled into those projects and like mostly working with engineers, but also trying to sort of bridge like, I'm kind of a structural brain person, so I love, like backing out like revealed preference costs and trying to figure out like what are real costs versus engineering costs. So sort of thinking through some of those things, but yeah, thanks for coming.
No, it sounds interesting. We're trying to write a project on transmission planning, and so we're trying to, it's pulling us to interacting a little bit more with thinking about these engineering power flow models, and but it's very different, and so we're trying to figure out how we can get something tractable.
Yeah. God, I'm super I'm having a bit of a brain fart, but yeah, thanks for coming.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
I love the paper. It's super cool. And I saw that you guys revised it in December. Like I think I had read like a super early version of it, because I saw Jenny present it like years ago.
Okay.
But
Yeah, he said he knew you.
yeah, it's funny, like I took, I took structural with Andrew Sweeting, and then I was like, I'm never gonna touch dynamic stuff, and then, ended up writing a dynamic job market paper, so
Okay.
it's just how things go sometimes, I guess.
Yeah. Definitely.
So great, I'll let you get back to your day. Thanks for coming.
Okay, sounds great. Well, it's great meeting you, and thanks a lot for having me. And yeah,
Yeah.
lots of interesting stuff to think about. All right.